Hello, today I'm going to talk briefly, I hope, about gender and sexual orientation. This lecture will cover both of the courses I'm teaching, so the exam that covers this material will be different for the two classes. However, I do want to say that there will be at least one thing I'm going to mention in this lecture, and I will identify it. It will likely be on the examination, but it's not in the PDF that I have included, posted in Canvas. So be sure to write down whatever it is I mention as something that will be on the exam that you won't find anywhere else. Make a note of it, please. Okay, well, gender and sexuality. Some may see them as somewhat equivalent, but they are not. If you've watched the lecture or read the material on race and ethnic groups and racism, you were introduced to the concept that race is a social construction. Gender is also a social construction. Now, it has a bit more of a biological basis for the most part than race, but it's still, the form that it takes is varies with time and place across cultures and through history. So we'll go into a little more detail on that in just a moment when I share my screen and go through this usual. All right, a presentation. Some decorations for the title slide. Here is a woman in an area of the Caucasus Mountains, present-day Albania, I believe, who dresses as a man, lives as a man. It's not considered that unusual in the particular culture in which she's in. I will, let's see here, I don't remember exactly what the Albanian word for someone who chooses to do this is, but she is not alone. We have a group of women getting ready to go on a march to demand the right to vote in England, I believe. To talk about gender socialization and how that operates. It starts, obviously, it can really start before birth, but it really kicks into high gear when someone is very young. Traditionally, or it had been the case in the United States, that certain sports tended to be considered boys' sports, and certain toys were marketed for boys and different toys were marketed for girls. Here we have a very young male football player. Here's a toy I remember my sister having, the Easy Bake Oven. These were definitely marketed at little girls. It was basically just a box with a light bulb in it, and they produced some specific mixes of things that you could cook with merely the heat from a light bulb. Okay, this is a scene outside the Stonewall Inn in New York City, which is really where the modern gay rights movement began. This was probably on Pride Day. It's display of flowers. We'll talk a little more about Stonewall later. A demonstration for LGBT equality, and another sort of a demonstration here, which I will get to later. So you see, no means no. These are women who are asserting their right to dress however they wish and want to make it clear that the way they are dressed is not intending to send a signal to random males that it's okay to take advantage of them. So, many things about our beliefs about one another and what's the expectations that we have of other people and we accept for ourselves, the beliefs about what is appropriate, what is correct, all these things. We're not born with them, we learn them, and everyone has, and nobody has been born with them. Sometimes they are based on someone or the writings of someone who's revered for one reason or another, but no matter what, a lot of our social world is our own product. It's a social construction. It's a way of doing things that simply is an institutionalization of habits that were accepted at some point in time and continue to be accepted on an everyday basis and repeated. Yes, repeated. Our behavior both reflects and reproduces social structures, which are our products, basically. There are no social structures that exist without human beings to engage in certain roles, perform certain roles, engage in certain activities that constitute the essence of a social institution, for example, or structure. They're broad, the social structure, social institution are very closely related in meaning. You can use them interchangeably in most cases. But so when you hear the term social structure or institution, remember that is a human product. It's dependent upon us. It's our actions that produce not only these little pockets of behavior we call structures or institutions, but social reality as a whole. So I should have introduced you in the previous lecture on core concepts or on theory or on introductory concepts of sociology to the book, The Social Construction of Reality by Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, published in the 1960s. That was very influential. Their idea was basically that there are many ways to do things, but sometimes a group of people will settle on one way of doing something, and that becomes what's seen as normal. The reality is that this is how this is done. Now you can extrapolate that to things that are not material. For instance, an example I often use is there are many ways to make shoes, but different cultures have different distinctive types of shoes historically and over time. So shoes is a material example. I'm not really talking about material things, but the same idea can be conveyed towards a lot of the social roles and responsibilities that come to the person who has a particular role. So anyway, moving on, social construction of everything. This is written in a much more organized fashion than what I've just said, but yeah, obviously the idea is that we're working upon nature. We're doing something with it to make a world of our own, but it is not nature itself or the natural world that is reproducing itself in a social form. We are doing this, we are creating it. A lot of the ideas of social constructivism or constructionism, whichever you prefer, you can relate to W.I. Thomas's Thomas theorem. What's believed to be true has true consequences, so, or real consequences. So now social constructionism has an opposite called essentialism, the idea that certain things, genders, cultures, have a fixed and invariant nature, an essence. It's always like that. You hear essentialist claims about men or women quite frequently, or about different racial and ethnic groups. Essentialism goes far back to ancient Greek philosophy, but it's basically the idea that there is something about individuals that have certain characteristics which will never change. It's like that for everyone that shares some whatever feature that is. So I won't belabor that, but as far as social construction of gender, what is gender? Okay, well, it is a social distinction. It's not biological. Definition here is that it's referring to social or cultural distinctions of behaviors that are considered male or female. Sex, on the other hand, is related to biology, physiology. So people tend to accept the expectations of others as a part, or they come to accept the expectations of others as a part of the socialization process. That includes accepting the group norms, which are ideas about the appropriate way to behave and certain habits, beliefs about others. People who are socializing the children, because that's when it begins, are usually initially the parents, but the term sociologists use agents of socialization. So, and often as part of this socialization, they are also performing some socially constructed role. And just as so much about who we think we are comes from our interactions with others, what gender we identify with or think we should identify with is also something that typically others have a large role in creating. Now, Judith Butler, a prominent philosopher and feminist, has argued that gender is not constructed, it's performed. It's something we do, not something we are. Here's an explanation. You can watch an explanation, her explanation of that concept here. More, or recently, we've broken more out of the notion of a gender binary, at least in many ways of thinking. We've escaped that. What is the gender binary? Well, that's the idea that there's male and female genders, and that's the way it should stay. And it's been fairly common that most cultures, societies think in terms of this gender binary, but it by no means covers the universe of ways to think about gender and ways to be. Here, we're going to look at this map. It's a very interesting interactive map of gender diverse cultures. So, okay, I'm going to have to move this to the screen I'm sharing. There we go. Okay. The link, of course, is in the PDF. So what we have here, map of the world, and on each of these little dots, you can find some information about a gender diverse culture. So let's see if we can find, okay, these Italians, these folks are the name Femminile, roughly little man, woman, biological males who dress as women and assume female gender roles. Now, gender role is what's expected of a person who's identified with a given gender. Except for adopting female gender roles, this might be much the same as transvestism. One might call them transvestites, people who just dress in the clothes of the opposite gender, but the fact that they are accepting the roles as well separates them from, or at least not separates them, but further refines them within this group. Perhaps I'm really not certain exactly how. Okay, the Bernesha from Albania. Remember that for the exam. Bernesha, Burnesa. The name means sworn virgins. They're women who take a vow of chastity and wear male clothing in order to be viewed as men in the highly patriarchal society of Albania. Also, you will find this tradition in Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, and the Balkans. I think I said the Caucasus Mountains. I take that back, the Balkans. They are becoming scarcer. It says here there are fewer than 50 left. So this way of life will likely vanish. Now let's look in the United States. Native Americans, or First Peoples. Lamana, or the Zuni nation, the two-spirit Zuni tradition. That's another, something else I might ask about on the exam, two-spirit. What does that refer to? Person lives both genders at the same time, not picking either one. Often they have a high status within Zuni culture. Additionally, Navajo, a third gender, biologically male-born person embodies both spirits. Female, Dilba, refers to a female-born person with more masculine spirit. So Native American, the Lakota Sioux, Winkte, again, it's for two-spirit people. So several of these groups recognized this possibility. It's having both genders, embodying both genders as one person. I believe we have some mixed Zapotec, Oaxaca. Males who either dress as women or dress as males with makeup, and they adopt feminine social roles. So if you're, there are other examples here, if you're curious, from around the world. So, move this back out of the way. Okay. All right, Facebook, there are probably more now, I'm not certain. In Facebook, you have more than 50 choices for gender identification when you set up your profile. Your parents are the primary agents of socialization, and there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that parents convey different, send different messages to boys and girls about the gender roles. That we don't have a lot of firm scientific evidence for this, but socialization is going to continue. Gender socialization, particularly once you enter school. Barry Thorne wrote a book called Gender Play, which is her empirical studies of 4th and 5th grade students at 2 different schools. So she found, among other things, not too surprisingly, a lot of children, they accept the beliefs that follow the lead of the popular kids, the cool kids. So, and she also discovered that they are kind of creating their own understandings of what gender means and of the changes that they may be experiencing in their bodies. World of sports, collegiate athletics used to be pretty much a men's domain. Women's programs couldn't get much funding from the university until the Title IX of the Education Amendments of the Civil Rights Act of 1972 required that there be a more equitable division of resources between men's and women's athletic programs. Okay, consumption and the media are also key players in gender socialization. Advertisements are targeted often for either a male or female, or a boy or a girl when they're young. I haven't really looked in the toy departments at any stores in a while, but it certainly used to be the toys were divided. The boys' toys and the girls' toys were segregated from one another. So sometimes even on opposite aisles. So there was not a lot of mixing. So We also get a lot of notions about how we're supposed to look. We get messages about the ideal body image for a female or a male. So from the media, from the mass media, from advertising, from television shows, from films, from online sources. So, these gender ideals about what a man or a woman's body should look like has changed a lot over time. It was not always the case that the anorexic look was promoted for women. I shouldn't say anorexic necessarily. That's more fashion models where you see that, but the idea that you have to be very thin, pretty thin, you know, your weight has to be limited in a very narrow range for women, and not so much for men, but there is some pressure there as well, has created a lot of health problems for young women with anorexia, bulimia. So in the Renaissance Europe, for instance, someone who was thin would have just been seen possibly as unhealthy. So even for women, there was, larger women were tended to be seen as more beautiful and healthier as well. So, and there is a connection, obviously, between the size of your body up to a certain point and your health, how much access you have to food, and how comfortable your life is. But that's not where I wanted to go with that. One of the gender ideals for men, of course, you have a musculature. It's the six-pack abs thing, which I've never had myself. I'm pretty much the same since I was 13, I think, but never very buff. So anyway, here's just another group of definitions. Gender identity is what gender you think you are. What do you identify with? It doesn't have to match your biological equipment. If you're transgender, that means that you identify with the gender other than what would be suggested by your genitalia, basically. That's what it comes down to. Transgender as an opposite term for those who identify with the gender that's suggested by their biology. That's cisgender. Cis and trans, if you take chemistry later, organic chemistry, you will come across those two terms. Cis means on the same side, trans on the opposite side. It's from, I believe it's Latin, it could be Greek. So transgender are individuals who identify with the behaviors and characteristics that are other than their biological sex. This is sometimes called gender dysphoria. There used to be other terms that were used. Gender identity disorder was once something which was listed in the American Psychiatric Association's list of disorders. That term is no longer there. I do not know for sure if anything related to transgendered identities is now, to tell you the truth. That would, if someone can find out and let me know, I'd appreciate it. Now, in some cases, a transgendered individual will decide that they should take steps, they should transition to make their body to this other gender physically, so their biology will match their gender identity. If someone has started down that road, which involves hormonal treatment and usually surgery, you would refer to them as a transsexual. Okay. Your gender identity doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your sexual orientation. You can be interested in either men or women, regardless of your gender identity. Okay, dating site OkCupid allows users to combine sexual orientations many sexual orientations with up to 50 gender identifications. So one of the more famous dead white European males to write about gender socialization is Sigmund Freud. You may know him as the founder of psychoanalysis. You'll hear more about him if you take psychology. But he believed that our biology was, the key to our minds in a sense. That gender, definitely for him, is directly rooted in your biology. So this is called biological determinism. Basically, if you have two X chromosomes, you are female, and you should identify as a woman, X and a Y, and male. Also, he felt that your psychological development that's associated with your gender is basically the same for everyone. And his ideas are not popular at all with feminists. His ideas were more about who you become depends upon something, whether you have something or you don't. It's kind of based upon absence in a way for women. So if you have a penis, you develop you go down a certain path, and you end up moving through what he called the Oedipal stage, and you have to resolve this Oedipal conflict, which he believed all males would do around the time they're 12, perhaps. Once you've done that, you've basically internalized the beliefs, the expectations, the norms of your father, and by extension, the norms of the larger society. So you have become socialized. So according to Freud, the reason this is called the Oedipal stage, he believed that the young male is jealous of the father. The father gets too much of the attention that he used to get exclusively as an infant. And there's actually it's actual sexual jealousy, but obviously that is inappropriate in most cultures. So that has to be resolved. And Freud believed that if you did not successfully resolve it, then you would have some sorts of mental issues, which he called neuroses, which provided patience for men such as him to provide lengthy and expensive treatment. Okay, so just as an aside, Oedipus was a king of thieves in Greece, Thebes. That might be on the test. Where did this term Oedipal come from, and why? Okay, Oedipus, if you've read the myth of Oedipus, you know that he, not knowing that this was his father, he killed his father. Oedipus had been abandoned as a child deliberately as a result of a prophecy made a prophecy made by the oracle at Delphi that the king had him abandoned, his own son abandoned, because the oracle told him that one day his son will kill him. So he thought, well, we'll get around that, we'll get rid of the son. And exposing an infant, meaning leaving them out to just die of exposure, was pretty common in the ancient world. Usually it tended to happen to the female children, but it could happen to anyone. And if an oracle told you that your firstborn male would kill you, you might be more likely to expose a male. Okay, well, but someone took this child in and raised him. Later, when he grew into a young man, he was traveling on a road and came across a very important person, he could tell, who had some armed bodyguards, and they all disagreed on one issue or another, and Oedipus ended up killing this man, who he later found out was the king of Thebes. Okay, so Oedipus went into Thebes, and then he solved another riddle, the riddle of the Sphinx, which lifted a curse from the people of Thebes that that Zeus or some other god had placed upon their heads. And as a reward, he was allowed to marry the widow of the dead king, which he did not know that was his mother. Okay, later in the story, he learns that he's been married to his mother and has had children with his mother, and he's so stunned and ashamed, he blinds himself. He gouges out both his eyes, and his two daughters lead him off into down the road. So that's a brief summary, and I know I mangled parts of the Oedipus myth. Nevertheless, so that's the connection. He killed his father, married his mother, not knowing it. So, and there's some evidence Freud did not, he claims that he learned, he developed this theory from treating patients, and he even identified some of them, not by their real names, but there's some evidence now that he may just have fabricated the whole thing. He may not have ever really encountered as many patients, if any, who had an unresolved Oedipal wish. So, okay, Freud thought that for female socialization, they identify with the mother because they do not have the phallus. They're missing something. They know that they're taught that they are not as good as men, and they become submissive. Feminist theorists have rejected these ideas. Here's a couple of the details of this rejection. According to Nancy Chodorow, who is a Freudian, by the way, but she's modified his theory, the boy does have to resolve this conflict, but rejecting the mother is what's involved, not identifying with the father, per se. And they they don't stay connected to their mother in the same way, so they tend to be dismissive of what they consider feminine behavior modes. So girls don't have this thing at all, so they stay close to the mother and identify with their habits and ways of doing things. Carol Gilligan, another psychologist, says that in this materialistic society, achievement-oriented society, women tend to be devalued because they are better at personal relationships than the cutthroat competition that you might see in the capitalist marketplace. They're more nurturant in her view. This is kind of getting near essentialism in a sense, so you can criticize it on that basis. But anyway, women develop a self-image based upon the idea, as a result of the dominant societies devaluing the value of nurturing in favor of achievement through competition. So I should bring in another term here, which I will, the patriarchy. The patriarchy is a social organization where men dominate women completely. And many feminists would argue, and there's definitely plenty of evidence for the fact our society is patriarchal. I mean, you can just, you don't have to look far to find that men do tend to dominate women. I mean, it's changing. It's been, and it should obviously change. I think society dominated by women would probably be much more peaceful, much healthier, and it could also turn out create some better males than what we're doing under the current arrangement. So, because I really like theory, I'm including some more theoretical approaches to it. The structural functionalists believe that socialization of children is vital, because it's if you don't have children and create families who will also grow up and have children, society is not going to continue into the future. Any social system that does not reproduce itself that way is going to end. So this is extremely important. Talcott Parsons, who was the major player in American sociology for a long time, he believed there had to be a distinct and unchangeable division of household labor and just specific gender roles for men and women that did not overlap too much. You would have the mother taking care of the children at home and the man working outside, earning the money. He believed that was the best system, and it was the most successful and efficient way to reproduce society. Well, he was really just extrapolating from the United States of the 1950s and 1960s, and to a great extent, he tended to see most of the social structures and processes of that period in the United States as clearly the best and the most functional, because the United States was the most powerful and affluent nation in the world at that time. So he was just kind of naturalizing his own, well, he's creating an ideology out of the America of the 50s and 60s to a certain extent. Many feminists found more ideas they could use in Marxist theory, a form of conflict theory. You probably recall Karl Marx from an earlier lecture. Friedrich Engels, his co-writer on many of his works, wrote a book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, published in 1884. He argued that originally humans had been a matriarchal society. People lived in small groups. Marriage was unknown. There was a state of what he called sexual communism when women were in charge. But when private property began to be a thing, when people were no longer just living communally on the same land, sharing it in common and not considering it as belonging to any one particular family or another. Once that began to change and people began dividing up the land amongst themselves and making claims to it, in his view, men began men had some concern about who would inherit this land that they perhaps shared with another woman. They knew it would be their children, but they wanted to be sure that these children were in fact theirs. So they began to organize things in such a way that they could control women's behavior. Now, this is Engels' theory. There's little, if any, evidence for a lot of this from archaeology or anthropology. But anyway, Engels said that men created a patriarchal society in order to protect their property. So the feminists also pointed out that in a capitalist system, women are doing unpaid labor, because if they don't feed and care for the males who go to work in the factories, there aren't going to be any people in the factories. So there are several variants and phases of feminist theory. The liberal feminist gender inequality can be corrected just by changing attitudes and perhaps some legislation and some more to ensure equal treatment in various dimensions, especially equal pay in the workplace, the right to vote. That's an older one. So you don't have to do anything more than reforms of the existing system. Radical feminists think more radical change. The word radical comes from the Greek word for root. You get to pull the root out and plant something new. And many radical feminists see capitalism as really at the root of the problem of female inequality and oppression and the dominance of men through patriarchal social order. African American feminists use the concept of intersectionality to highlight how Black women have different experiences than many of the liberal, well-educated white women that dominated the feminist movement early on. You have postmodern feminists who they don't believe in that any big story can include all, can be really legitimate, that these big stories of overarching narratives of how history proceeds, or these essentialist claims about this is how women are, this is how men are, etc. They don't believe that those are anything more than a vehicle for one group to obtain and keep power over another group, even if they are true, which postmodernists have a troubled relationship with truth. They don't believe that you can really ever establish it. That's not all postmodernists would agree with that, but with what I just said. But they were suspicious of the ideas of progress, of science, of a lot of things. So anyway, they are suspicious of the idea of patriarchy because they don't think that you can squeeze everything that goes on vis-a-vis gender inequality in modern society into the patriarchy box, so to speak. They view it as essentialist because it's implying that there are certain things that have to be true of men. So, nevertheless, here's some examples of how women were truly treated unequally in the United States. So just read through those when you have a chance. It's many of these you already know or encountered or suspect. Let's look at economics, where the so-called, all right. If you want detailed data, if you want to make your own charts and see some more information, here are two links. These are, I believe, Census Bureau links. Let's see what we have here. Oh, good. It's going to, yeah, Bureau of Labor Statistics, another federal agency. They probably both are. But here, his women's earnings as a percent of men's by age. Okay, this is a trend chart basically. Along this axis is time. It only goes to 2007. I did not find an updated graph that had all four groups. So this is the percent of men's income that women in these age groups make. Now you see here in 2017, women between the ages of 16 and 24 make about 95% of what men make. So think about the reasons for that. There are several. The one I've thought of is that when you're 16 to 24, you probably have a minimum wage job. You're working at fast food or something like that. You're not, there isn't a lot of difference between the highest and lowest paid in these sorts of jobs that 16 to 24-year-olds tend to have. 25 to 34, you see the percentage that women making this is a full-time and for people working full-time, I believe. So in this is 2007. I said 2017, sorry. So these are different groups, and you see the biggest gap is for women between 45 and 54 years. So in many cases, women have had to take off time from work for the purpose of raising children or having children for a while. So often their career is put on hold for a while. They may not advance as far, but as we will see, there's something called a glass ceiling. It seems that women only advance so far in a given organization. Here's a more up-to-date chart that takes us through 2017. In 2017, women earned 80.5% of the income that men did. So in other words, for every dollar a man makes who's this is the median earnings of full-time year-round workers 15 years and older over this period. That median, you should recall. If you don't, you should check out the lectures that have been posted. It's the midpoint, half above, half below. So what this tells us is that 50% of the women, or not 50%, it's not an average. So it's the midpoint. You take all women working full-time, line them up from the lowest income to the highest income, find the point right in the middle. Do the same for men, take the ratio of these 2 points, and it's women's income is 80% of what men make at that level. So, and here we have it, the same thing. This figure should be 80.5%. Here you see a plot of their median earnings over time. And you look right here in 1974, there's a big gap. Women were not even quite at 30%. No, I'm sorry, these are in thousands of dollars, 2017 dollars, about 30,000 a year for the median worker, female worker, and roughly 55 for men. So it's narrowed considerably. A few more charts breaking it down by age. Again, this is in 2018, so this is more up to date. So these are histograms. What you see on this axis is the earnings in current dollars. And here are the age groups. So again, you see 16 to 24, not a lot of difference. But you see a lot of difference in 45 to 54 and 55 to 64. Not quite so much difference for this group, 65 and older, not quite as much difference, but many, it's still significant. Because for instance, if you're just drawing Social Security, the amount of money you get is based upon the amount of money you earned. So if you earn less, you're going to get a smaller Social Security check. So this is the most current data I could find. You can look at it by race as well, so get a little more intersectional perhaps, women and men in different races. So each of the blue are women, the dark blue is women, the lighter blue are men. And this, again, this is earnings in current dollars from 2018. And again, it's the median, it is the midpoint. So this reflects patterns we've seen elsewhere. Occupation. This is from 2014 data, Bureau of Labor Statistics. 2014, women made up 57% of bartenders were women in 2014 compared to 27% in 1970. Secretaries, well, not a whole lot of change there. In 1970, 98% of women were secretaries were women. 94% of secretaries were women in 2014. But you go over here, chemists, engineers, male dominated. Police and sheriff's officers, lawyers, not too surprising. Physicians, 3 to 1, men, really. Nursing is another female dominated occupation. It's only changed slightly in 44 years, from 91 to 90%. Not much change there. I'm not going to go through all this, but these are male-dominated occupations in which women are increasingly represented. So automobile body repair, police, airplane pilots, mechanics. You see a lot of growth because they're starting from a small number of people, of women working in those fields in 1983. Here are some female-dominated occupations where men increase their shares of employment. Dressmakers, almost 3 times as many as there were in 1983. And here's some more information. A lot of workplaces can be called gendered workplaces, or many organizations can be called gender organizations. What that means is your career path, your daily life is determined in many ways by your gender, or at least there's separate paths for different genders. I don't want using the word determine is not that appropriate, but it's definitely connected with the glass ceilings. I mentioned that already. Women are not promoted easily to places with the most to jobs with the most authority, unless oddly the company is having big issues and they may need another spokesperson who can take some of the heat. That's often where you see the women promoted into these higher level positions. Feminists have called this the glass cliff. They could be pushed off the cliff. So there's also the concept of a glass escalator, where yes, women can move up the career ladder, but they're on this career escalator. They're moving up in income, but they notice there's another escalator on the other side of this glass, separating them, and the men are on that, and they're moving a lot faster. So one big goal of the women's movement has been to try to find a way to implement comparable worth policies and make salaries and compensation more equitable across gender lines. To take a short break.